Well, my next guest just hosted the Taliban's acting foreign minister in Doha in Qatar. Sultan Barakat is director of the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies at Doha Institute. And you can see them both here in this photo that he tweeted out. And Sultan Barakat joining me now live. Candid and professional is how the US at least described their talks with the Taliban's representatives in Doha, and without disclosing, I have to say, the substance of what was discussed. What came out of your conversation with the acting foreign minister?
Well, we didn't go into the details of what was discussed between Taliban and the US. But in general, what was said during the 1.5-hour conversation, which is available on YouTube for everyone to watch, was first that they seem to have a genuine will to reform what was in the past the conditions under which the Taliban were known. They are keen to engage with the rest of the world. They would like, ideally, to be able to receive international assistance, particularly development assistance, maybe humanitarian assistance in the short term. They have made some commitments towards specific targets for girls' education in particular, on human rights, on inclusion in terms of politics with other political parties. And he was arguing throughout that what is required really is a bit of time. His argument centered around the fact that they have been only in power for a few weeks, and the world seems to be demanding of them what the previous government could not achieve in 20 years with the support of many, many nations and billions of dollars. So time was one aspect. We also discussed, and he kind of dodged the question around whether there are differences in opinions within the movement. I personally believe maybe some of those differences started to appear now that the challenge is very different. In the past, when they were fighting, they were all united. They had a very clear one target to get the whom they perceive as occupiers out of the country. Now, with the reconstruction, state building coming challenges, they have slightly different, I think, priorities, and some particularly conservative elements among the group may view issues such as gay rights or similar issues as too controversial for them to even tackle at this stage.
Because those fissures are incredibly important. There does seem to be a disconnect between what the team in Doha is saying and the group's actions on the ground.
Yes, I think it's important to understand the nature of Taliban, the movement. It's made of many, many layers and lots of alliances between smaller groups and tribal groups from different parts of the country. And they all come under extremely different cultural understandings also that depends on their geographical position and so on. So there is no one uniform opinion across the movement, and the greater you go into details, the greater the differences appear to be. They all agree on the bigger picture, the bigger ideology, but the moment you start discussing sub-policies and how they can be applied and when should they be applied and to whom should they be applied, I think it is inevitable that there will be more than one view on this. And they have their own way of making decisions, which tends to rely on extensive and sometimes really extended negotiations amongst themselves until the leader comes up with the ultimate decision that all then follow.
I mean, we just saw from my colleague Clarissa's reporting that although the Taliban's religious police has been instructed to be more moderate, vulnerable Afghans say brutal justice is still being meted out. They're clearly not showing the world that a zebra can indeed change its stripes, are they? Look, Qatar today has said that it does not see the recognition of the Taliban as a priority. However, engagement does remain important. And we've heard from the EU that these talks are specifically informal. The US is certainly not recognizing the Taliban by holding these talks with them in Doha. Do you think the Taliban shares that view, that recognition is not a priority for them?
No, I think they seek recognition, and they have been seeking recognition as a movement for many, many years. And I think they've smartly used part of the negotiation with the United States and then between them and the rest of the Afghan people to get some form of recognition from the rest of the world. And as you know, they were invited around the various capitals to try and encourage them to move in a way of peace. But now I think it is important to them, and the sooner it comes, the better. But they're also pragmatic about the position of the international community. They understand that the international community is under pressure from its own people, their own voters back home. They have certain demands and priorities. And I think they accept that. And for now, a degree of dialogue is very important. I think it is important to avoid a humanitarian disaster with the coming of very harsh conditions of winter in Afghanistan, coming straight after a drought, the displacement that happened inside the country. All of this creates a very difficult humanitarian situation.
Yeah, and it's quite clear from the international community at this point that assets will be frozen until more is seen from the Taliban with regard their attitude towards women's rights and human rights, etc. Look, you just said that the interview or the discussion that you had with the acting foreign minister is online and you know, it's there for people to see. I just want our viewers to have a listen to some of what was said. Hold on.
The agreement of Doha of February 2020 between Afghanistan and the world, particularly with the United States of America, is to be defined as good relationship fact. I believe that the full implementation of the Doha Agreement can, between us and the United States of America, tackle any problems between our relationship.
Let's be quite clear, and I'm looking at this from Washington's perspective to a certain extent. One important strand from the Doha Agreement was a pledge by the Taliban to prevent groups like Al-Qaeda, for example, from operating in areas under Taliban control. But in the most recent round of talks just over this weekend, the Taliban said they would not cooperate with the US over counter-terrorism. Did you discuss that? And why is that? Why have they said that they will not support the US in fighting extremism?
I wasn't really party to those talks, so I don't know why they would refuse that. But I suspect it's because maybe allowing the US back to fight terrorism means also that the US would inevitably infringe on the sovereignty of Afghanistan again. The US will only be able to use drones in its fight against terrorism in Afghanistan. And of course, the optics of that will not be good for the Taliban and their followers, to having pushed them out of the country, to allow them the free hand to operate inside the country. The difficulty, I think, between the two is there are no means of verification, objective and independent means of verification that the Taliban have really met the conditions of the Doha Agreement. At the same time, the Taliban, I think, may understand the Doha Agreement may be slightly different from what the US, or how the US does, in that from the US side, it was very important that the political settlement between the Taliban and the rest of the Afghans is an integral part of this agreement. They somehow managed to extract that dimension of the agreement, partly because they say that the president fled the palace on the 15th of August, and therefore there is no government to negotiate with, and partly because they really never maybe intended to negotiate to this level of detailing. But in any case, they don't see eye to eye on this agreement until now. Some of the conditions that were embedded in it, like a release of prisoners, is no longer there because they've already managed to release all their prisoners. The only way forward, I believe, is to introduce a good verification mechanism to ensure that the Taliban genuinely have addressed the issues, particularly in relation to Al-Qaeda.
So, yeah, and I'm interested to know what you think that mechanism would be. I mean, you know, what does that look like? There is a complete deficit of trust as far as the international community is concerned. I mean, in a recent op-ed in Al Jazeera, you write, quote, humanitarian assistance is one of the only common languages shared by the Taliban in Kabul and the West today. You know, on all sides, there is a strong will to communicate, yet what is missing is an effective medium for dialogue. What do you mean by that?
I think there is still a need to build confidence. I think a political settlement overall in Afghanistan is still needed, as much as it was on the 14th of August. They haven't reached that, and the Taliban understand fully that there is no way they can control the whole country in a sustained way on their own. They must reach some kind of settlement with the others. And then in terms of humanitarian assistance, I think it could be taken as a first step to start further engagement with the Taliban and better understanding. And then on the back of this, you can introduce more complex, sophisticated mechanisms that they would allow them to look at different targets. At this moment, what appears from their position is that they have, for almost 18 months, avoided targeting any American soldier. There has been no American casualties for a long time. They helped the United States in its evacuation. The evacuation of 120,000 people could not have happened without the Taliban coordinating very closely with the United States, maybe with the support of Qatar at some stage. But they were on the ground and they allowed this to happen. They continue to show cooperation in terms of safe passage to people out of Afghanistan. But in return, the international community has blocked their assets. They basically disabled their banking system, which they see as very unfair. If you don't want to give money, fine, but why would you disable the banking system and then push the whole economy underground? And that is going to be very dangerous in terms of narcotics and other criminal activities. And I think humanitarian aid may be that one possibility where the two sides see eye to eye, and it would be of use to all.
Fascinating. Thank you very much indeed for your perspective.